Hello, this is Gary Sokolow at Florida DOT, and I welcome you all here for one of our ongoing webinars on all things site impact, access management, level of service, and anything that might be of interest to our people out there. And with that, let me just introduce the people who will be presenting today, and they are Richard Barr from Kimley Horn Associates in the Tallahassee office, and Brian Smokowski from the Minneapolis office, correct? Or am I wrong? Ah, good. Okay, both of these gentlemen have years of experience using level of service. Matter of fact, they are the ones who edited the last rewrite of our level of service handbook. Brian is a member of the Highway Capacity Manual TRB committee. And what happened is, some of you may know, and you're going to hear more about this, that we are going through a lot of changes here at Florida DOT based on the Complete Streets implementation plan. And a lot of things are changing, so be aware. Matter of fact, I think the biggest change that many of you are going to see out there will be that by next July we should have a brand new design manual, and the design manual will incorporate a lot of the design sections of what is now called the Plans Preparation Manual. It's going to be a lot more comprehensive, and it will also incorporate a lot of the context sensitive planning that is the centerpiece of Complete Streets. So stay tuned on that. So one of the things that came out of an initial scoping study on Complete Streets was, well, do we need to do something with level of service? And we actually, maybe some of you out there heard that California did away with level of service, and that sounded interesting. But what we found as we delved deeper into it, that it wasn't so clear. So Kimley Horn and Associates, Richard Barr specifically, and Brian Smokowski had, what they did is arranged for written and spoken interviews with the experts around the country with us, and they have documented it, and I will let you go from here, Richard and Brian.
All right, thank you very much, Gary. We'll provide an overview and then provide different opportunities for the audience to ask questions. And sorry about that. And please use your chat function in within the GoToMeeting, and we will keep note of those as they come across and try to answer them. We'll have a couple different breaks here where we'll focus and have some time to ask some questions. So
there's also a question function, which has a little bit more power to it. We can all see it, and though either way, chat or question box, we will respond in some way to you.
Perfect. Well, Gary has helped set up the purpose of this a little bit, was to evaluate the Florida Department of Transportation's current level of service policies and practices used to help manage the state's transportation system. And this benchmarking study process was really look at the policies as stated in other states' written plans, and then also find out how they are applied in practice. The finding out how they were applied in practice was a key part of this study, was really looking at and really interviewing identified states in order to understand how their policies are applied. So the outcome of this was really to use this information to inform a change, if any, to the Florida Department of Transportation's level of service policy. So we identified a number of states that that had some unique approaches to level of service, had a varied approach, and this was very good for us to, again, understand how they are applied in policy. So in the month of July, we had a number of agency, partner agency meetings, including Pennsylvania DOT, Washington DOT, Minnesota DOT, New Jersey DOT, Oregon DOT, and Gary already mentioned Caltrans had this interesting change in their policy of doing away with level of service in their environmental review process. So certainly they were one that made the short list of folks we wanted to talk to and understand how they're applying and really evaluating mobility, both in development review and also in some follow-up discussions, how they are using different measures to help prioritize projects going forward. We had several key questions that we asked each of the DOTs, and we did this in two parts. One, just trying to have an initial contact. Well, first, actually doing some research online before that, but then also having some initial contact, but then also setting up these interviews that were an hour and a half in length in order to dive deeper into how these are applied. But the key questions we asked between these different methods of outreach was, does the state have a level of service policy? And if so, to what extent is it applied in development review? And if so, are level of service thresholds utilized for alternative modes? And if not, what is used to evaluate mobility impacts of proposed development? And if not, how is planning for alternative modes evaluated? We want to see really, and my personal interest from being on the Highway Capacity Committee is how are the multimodal level of service procedures applied around the country. Also asked the question, do level of service criteria change dependent upon the urban character or density of the area? We also asked what tools are utilized to assess level of service in proposed projects. And do any of the local governments within the state utilize alternative mobility analysis tools? So these were the key core questions that we asked, but also during the hour and a half interviews, we found of the 6 interviews we had, the conversations went in a lot of different directions. So we have these as a base, but also each state really had a unique approach and therefore unique responses to these questions, and those discussions went different directions. So we'll start with Pennsylvania. Had the meeting on the 13th with Michael Zerko, the only one that could attend, and the way PennDOT is organized is they are decentralized. They have 11 districts, and the way they approach level of service or mobility measurement is really inconsistent from district to district, not unlike Florida in some ways. They are the approving agency for permits to gain access to state highway system or occupy state-controlled highway right-of-way. So as development gets proposed, they do require a traffic impact study when it's projected that there'd be more than 100 trips during the peak hour, or that the Pennsylvania DOT determines the site will likely have a significant impact on highway safety or traffic flow. And they typically follow ITE's recommended practice for impact studies. And they also look at the analysis must include a scenario that is 5 years following the opening year. as we look at what's in their documentation, how they want to apply or measure mobility for these types of studies, they have basically a two-part test. They do look at level of service, and they also look at delay. And what their targets are really based on what the existing or no build condition is. And they're looking, and there's a lot of different ways to measure level of service and delay. So in the case of Pennsylvania, they're looking at the overall intersections. This is the total intersection delay that they're looking at. But their two-part test is, what is the existing level of service, and does it then, with the project, does it maintain that level of service, or does it have less than a 10-second change in delay at that total for that overall total intersection? That way, even if it does change a level of service just because the pre-existing level of service was right at that boundary condition, it doesn't really force an unnecessary mitigation because they have the second part of the test with delay. So they have a flow chart within their guidelines of how they go through this process, whether or not the level of service requirement is met. Then it's just pretty simple. The traffic impact study would be approved. If it's not met, there's a lot of different ways they can look at this, and whether or not there's a build improvement that's possible, then they would look for that to be made and then approve the traffic impact study. Then if it's an infeasible improvement, they look at that a little deeper, looking at whether or not there is a significant degradation in level of service, or just a marginal degradation, or just ultimately if there's not a feasible improvement that will improve situations. When we asked about multimodal, it was very specific that they do not use the multimodal level of service analysis. They do use specific mode split factors in order to account for people using other ways of getting around other than automobile. Then as they're getting to as we look at mitigation, when mitigation to address the level of service becomes infeasible, they may require an alternative transportation plan to focus on promotion of other modes. Richard, is there anything else you wanted to add about our discussion with Pennsylvania?
No, I think that covers it. I know for each of the states we did ask what tools they did use to measure level of service, and typically they do use Synchro and HCM methods, so nothing out of the ordinary there.
All right. So let's pause here for a second and provide the opportunity for any questions at this point. We'll be going through the other 5 states and then share kind of our overall findings and some of the direction that has been provided to DOT for their consideration and how they change their policy in the future, or how it's applied. We did have a question here of what procedures do they use for determining an acceptable modal split. For Pennsylvania, it was kind of prescribed and rather low. Basically, anywhere from 2 to 4% potentially for using alternative modes were things that they typically applied. It seems like they would be overestimating the impacts of motor vehicle traffic in their more urban conditions, but they just didn't really have a good methodology on how to apply that. But it was rather low. All right, well, we'll move on to the next state. If you have any other questions, feel free to type them into the question or chat box. So the next state we talked to was Washington DOT. We were able to attract a broader cross-section of folks from policy, program management, operations, and planning as part of the discussion. And by state statute, Washington DOT shall set the level of service standards for state highways. And these standards are set through policy rather than being included within the statute. Washington DOT's role, authority, and organization is very decentralized, much like Pennsylvania. They have the opportunity to review development proposals that impact state facilities. However, a local agency has the decision-making authority for land use proposals, so they're really an advisory body on this for this case. When we talked about traffic impact analysis scope, that is determined by the local agency, specifically the area that may include significant and adverse impacts. The Development Services Manual from Washington DOT suggests that DOT is involved when volumes at any state highway intersection are expected to increase by 25 peak hour trips or more. But again, it's more of an advisory role for the DOT. So they have level of service standards published as goals, and they have a lot of variation on them based on the context. So they try to take that into consideration, that their core areas and other more urbanized areas, we should not have as high of a level of service standard, and instead more goes towards this E, or even this mitigated E in the inner urban area, as noted there on the regionally significant state highways. And basically what that notes is congestion should be mitigated by using other modes such as transit and other investments when the PM peak hour LOS falls below E. So as you get more into the rural area within Washington, then they have those higher level of service standards of C, and again, more urban to E or mitigated E. So as they look at mitigation, even with poor level of service, they typically recommend non-construction alternatives. When the no build is level of service E, the expectation is some form of alternative mitigation, investment in other modes, investment in sidewalk infrastructure or trails, or investments in supporting infrastructure for transit. They're in the process of refining new goals for design projects and really moving towards a performance-based design approach. And this is consistent with a lot of the other discussions we've had, is with this performance-based design approach, they have flexibility in selection of performance measures, and level service may not be one, or may be minimized greatly. With a lot of the moves with MAP 21, there's a lot of discussion of, and the FAST Act, of using measures such as reliability, travel times, and multimodal measures are becoming more and more important and taking precedence over level of service. And then in local areas, the multimodal performance measures that they've defined a variety of creative measures, looking at things such as mobility units, which is person miles of travel, or trip density, which is daily person trips per acre. Again, this provides them a lot more flexibility in really what your measure is, what you're trying to achieve. And so if they're trying to achieve an urban, a healthy urban environment, what they want to really try to maximize is mobility by all modes. So some of these draft recommended performance measures that they have are looking at overall mobility, all of them, it's looking at person delay. When you're looking at your vehicular modes of auto, freight, or transit, it's level of service, but not only that, it's travel time reliability, and volume to capacity. Transit, they're looking at transit seats occupied, average operating speed, and park and ride spaces occupied. Bike is miles of continuous bike facilities, so the availability of facilities, and looking at whether there's gaps and how large those gaps are in the bike facility network. Pedestrian is similar measures, miles of continuous ped facilities and number and size of gaps. And then looking at overall that intermodal network, because every trip really has a component of a pedestrian trip, so tying pedestrian, bike, and transit together is really important. So it's a number of gaps in the intermodal network in feeder miles. So we'll pause there and see if there are any other questions.
This is Gary. I have a question. Um, uh, will these be available? The documents that especially like the Pennsylvania and New Jersey be available? Oh, the answer is yes. We will send you a link to them sometime when we summarize this presentation. And so I asked the question and I answered it.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
There's a question here regarding highway. What is the threshold level of volume for level service E in each state? That's an interesting question. It's certainly depends on the features along the roadway. The Florida Department of Transportation has developed their generalized level of service tables where they've looked at varying facilities across the state and have provided which are essentially average conditions of how many signalized intersections per mile and how much green time is allocated to the main line, how much vehicles are turning, and have produced some tables that are available in the base peak hour, peak direction form, and then scaled up to the peak hour, not looking at in different, the combined two-way volumes, and then also looking at all the way at daily. So I'd say that question really depends on what those base conditions are or what those base assumptions are, because there are certainly a lot of cases within Florida where that capacity, that level of service E threshold is higher than what's in the generalized service volume tables. But in those cases, a lot of at least on an arterial system, the assumption of green time on the main line is the main thing that changes. And if that's higher than 44% of the time, then it would be higher than what's in the generalized service volume tables. And you may see those as high as 65 or even 70% of the time, which would greatly impact your level of service E threshold.
It was real interesting when we were reaching out to these states that, we were trying to get some information from them, and they were really interested in that and appreciated that. But most of these states were looking at Florida for a number of years of what we were doing here, and kind of copying, in some cases, a lot of things that we were doing here. Like Washington, Brian mentioned that they had created their own tables, very similar to what FDOT has done.
One other question here is, are there any thresholds in the measures of effectiveness that would make a project fatally flawed? in a lot of ways, the way Washington's approaching and some of the ways we're seeing some of the other states approach things are, um, it's it depends. It's not a great answer for you, but it does depend. Um, the all those different proposed measures that Washington has, depending on the context, they may have higher priority. So we're seeing a lot of environmental documents as you're looking at a project's purpose and need and evaluating potential uh, projects that could address that purpose and need. During that purpose and need stage is where they're trying to understand the priorities of the stakeholders along that particular potential project, and providing a custom scale of what's important, what's less important, and in some cases level service comes completely off the table as a performance measure that has any importance.
This is Gary Socolo. I'm trying to also put my 2 cents in on that question. The thresholds of the measures of effectiveness is extremely detailed kind of question. We did ask many detailed questions of the states we talked to. Things like, do they consider level of service of a corridor like we do in Florida? Many states only look at the level of service of signals. We asked whether they get into the details of, let's say, levels of service of lane groups. We spoke to a few that use volume to capacity ratios. But I think as Brian said, I think when push comes to shove and everything is F, what most of the professionals do is actually use their professional judgment and look at and that's why one of the reasons we did this is that level of service is just one measure. And you know, we have been asked to look at other measures and other ways to evaluate projects.
One other question that came up is the engineering community establishing these measures with actual data, or is it from the planning community? It's really a blend of both in the discussions we've had. In a lot of cases, it's the engineers that are moving away from level of service and using some of these other measures, which are absolutely rooted in data. It's just that a lot of states have come to the realization in their suburban and especially in their urban environments, some of these measures are kind of counter to some of the other goals that they have. Livability, multimodal, a robust multimodal network, and just trying to achieve a level of service D on everything is counter to a lot of those other goals. So again, that's where it happens a lot on the environmental process, is really establishing relative priorities of your overall goals and then measuring against those. But yeah, they are based on actual data. All right, we'll move on. The third interview we had was with the Minnesota DOT. We're able to talk to a variety of a traffic operations engineer, a design engineer, and a transportation planner. Minnesota's unique amongst these that they really had no statewide policy. They do have their role in authority and organization is generally they have no authority over land use. They can only make recommendations. It's really they're providing the recommendations to the local governments who have that authority, and partnering with them to implement any potential mitigation or improvements that they would like to see done. When the development requires work in right-of-way or a new access point, they do have the authority to deny a permit. and they have the authority to request access closure from an existing site when there is a significant land use change. So similar authority as other states. And when it comes to traffic impact analyses, at least from a statewide perspective, they are typically only involved when there is an impact to the interchange ramp terminals. Now, even though they don't have a policy, they do within their guidelines have these primary measures of level of service, looking at and basing that what the target condition is based on what the existing or no build condition is. And when they're looking at the intersections, it's based on, again, on total intersection delay. And when they're looking at unsignalized intersections, they're looking at only those primary road movements only, because they recognize the fact that on unsignalized intersections, if you're looking at level of service on the stop-controlled intersection, it often is a pretty poor level of service, but then there really is no reason to mitigate, because that's really just a level of delay is acceptable when there's a lot of volume along a major road. So this is done in the engineering review and engineering, but beyond that, they're not using level of service. They're not really hanging their hat on level of service, I should say. They really want to look at that as an input, but will typically make recommendations that balance all modes over a full day. For example, one thing they note is they avoid double left turns if possible, at all, in as many costs as they can, because of the increasing crossing distance and the other impacts that it has on the overall intersection. They will overlook some congestion and level of service issues in order to improve the environment for other modes. And as they're looking at their overall program beyond an individual intersection, then they have other agency performance measures that are much more important to them that they are using to make those types of decisions. They're looking at travel time reliability, buffer time index, and planning time index in order to make decisions on their overall program. Level of service has no input in their project prioritization. Person throughput, so that they can incorporate multimodal travel into that and look at options that, if you're putting more seats in a bus or a train, that improves the overall travel situation along a corridor. So they're looking at that overall person throughput. And then when it comes down to operations, they're really not putting their time into any expansion or any significant improvements to the intersections. Where they're investing their efforts are in signal coordination and optimization. They're looking, the performance measures that they really focus on are delay, stops, and fuel consumption on an overall corridor level rather than an individual intersection level. Richard, anything to add for Minnesota?
No, but when they were discussing this with us, this state more than the others, it seemed like they were really taking a hard look at benefits versus costs. And as you mentioned, the not necessarily just trying to fix a peak hour problem, but looking at the whole day. And they seem to be looking at the trade-offs more than the other states. At least they verbalized that to us.
So one question we had here was, if they're trying to avoid double lefts, what's their opinion on triple lefts? So I'm trying to think if I've ever observed triple lefts in the state, and I honestly cannot think of a situation where that is a built condition there. Their opinion would be, if they need to go to that level of solution, they don't have enough network, would be how I would characterize them. Minnesota's, I think, was unique amongst some of the states we talked to, is they have the benefit of a very, very robust network of principal arterials, major freeway segments, and at least in the metro areas, of, on a 3 to 6 mile spacing, you have freeways, and then you have principal arterials, major state facilities or county facilities that are higher speed on a mile spacing at a minimum. And then you have a collector network that's maybe a half-mile spacing or less in between there. And then your local road network is at a 400 to 600 foot spacing. So very rare would you get to a situation where triple lefts would even be necessary, just because there's a very robust network across the entirety of the functional classification scheme. So when we've observed those things happening, usually it means we need to build another road or a different road and not improve the road that's leading us to think we would need triple Fs. All right. The next state we talked to was New Jersey. And they have a level of service thresholds for unsignalized and signalized intersections that are established in their State Highway Access Management Code. The DOT's authority, that despite that authority that they have in the Highway Access Management Code, local agencies typically only require developers to study very local traffic conditions, really just adjacent conditions, just to minimize the scope of the analysis and also to minimize the involvement of partners in the decision-making process. The DOT departments are very segmented, and other modes are not involved at all in development review. So they look at a variety of performance measures. They're looking at all related: level of service, delay, and volumes capacity. And the reason they do this is depending on the existing condition, they want to look at, they have different standards. In an urban area, for example, if it's currently uncongested A through E, they would look for a less than a 25% of delay difference compared to the EF threshold. If it's F, they're looking to limit deterioration, and ultimately if their volume to capacity ratio is above 1.2, where they're seeing severe congestion, they would look to try to have no change in volume to capacity. And so they have these different standards based on those different existing or no-build conditions, and it varies. For signalized intersections, they have a different set of standards for unsignalized intersections that also vary by context, whether it's in the urban or rural area. When you're looking at uninterrupted flow segments, then their primary measure is volume to capacity. And as they're looking at ramp segments, they're looking at density and flow rate. One thing that we noted here is this specifically references the 1994 HCM, which is obviously several versions old. So with their looking at rural and urban areas differently, that allows for different saturation flow rates between regions. They have noticed within their studies that the saturation flow rate changes based on people's expectations and behavior in those areas, and really based on the overall density that they're accustomed to. For mitigation, they will lean on the developer to invest in improvements to mitigate back to the no-build when already at LOSF. A lot of cases where they're trying to get that mitigation is they'll look for fees from a developer to update the corridor coordination, because they ultimately know they can't build more, so they're looking for improved operational solutions such as signal coordination. The complete streets guidance is typically led at the local level, not led by DOT. And again, they're not really looking at other modes at the DOT level, but looking at these other modes is typically led at the local level. And design guidelines for roadway improvements, these will typically follow AASHTO and FHWA guidance for horizon year analysis. These so the AASHTO, so that's how they look at design guidelines for roadway improvements, is looking at the federal guidance. Pause here for questions. So one question here is did any agency give specific examples of multimodal or motor vehicle mitigation when required? When motor vehicle degradation, did they require full cost or roadway improvement or proportionate share? Or leading towards the focus on operational upgrades or balanced transportation network? Richard and others, feel free to add too, but my recollection of all of our discussions were most folks are realizing that they're not, a lot of the construction stuff is not going to meet their needs, and maybe beyond what a lot of the states were, it's beyond what they could ask for. So most of the mitigation that for roadways was really based on signal coordination was the primary one that was mentioned by most DOTs. In a lot of cases, they were telling the developer or the consultant for the developer not to propose the recommended improvements that they propose, because they're looking to keep their system right-sized and put investments in other modes. So a lot of the construction and fees that were assessed to developers were really for those multimodal improvements, looking at asking them to make sidewalk improvements or trail improvements, or provide money for those sidewalk and trail improvements to eliminate the gaps that are in the system. Richard, did you have any other?
I mean, it varied from state to state a little bit, and a common theme was, we're trying to do the best we can with what we've got, and try to get, if a roadway improvement does not make sense at all, to try to enhance the other modes. Network connectivity was a big thing that they're trying to do, but it varied. And again, it's they're doing the best they can is kind of a common theme that they had.
One other question here: can the information be expanded, organized to address the LOS approach and methods in two areas, planning and traffic operations? In the state of Florida, as well as other state DOTs, can be insightful for future direction. Absolutely. I mean, when we get to the conclusions, we'll maybe summarize this a little bit. We are blending the two, certainly, as they are very closely related. But we are seeing, even though a lot of the documentation has references to level of service seems to be predominantly in areas outside of Florida really utilized maybe at the intersection level, and even in that case, not as much as it has in the past. Another question was, is it at capacity? If it is at capacity, means level service F, how come VC greater than 1 has become a threshold 1.2? Good question. That 1.0 would be certainly it's the theoretical capacity, or what has been determined from research of what a roadway can realistically carry. But we are seeing conditions, quite frankly, in super congested and conditions and others that do exceed that that volume to capacity ratio. And certainly it also depends on the measure that is used to determine the level of service. In some cases, if you're looking at average travel speed to set your, or percent of base free flow speed, I should say, to set your level of service, and it's ultimately this is what is acceptable, even at a congested thing of a level of service F, then you can actually get to a point that's even less than F, and so there would be some variations of F. That's been some of the discussion at the committee level, and certainly was discussions with several of the states that we talked to, is that they're dealing with so much congestion at this time that basically a level of service F is kind of where it starts for them. E and F is normal, and so that there should be subgrades of F for them to actually really be able to do anything with the information. All right. Moving on to Oregon. We talked with Brian Dunn and Michael Rock. Brian is also a member of the Highway Capacity Committee, so certainly understands the national perspective, but we talked to them specifically about how level of service is applied in Oregon. And they have a transportation planning rule that requires all communities to develop and adopt a transportation system plan. And they have established mobility targets to guide their system planning, local transportation planning, and development review process. What they did is, so their role in authority and organization, they're involved during the system planning process as well as any local zoning change. They use mobility targets to provide an opportunity to be a part of any negotiations at the local level. One thing they did is, when we look at their measures, they went to using their primary measure being volume to capacity, and part of the reason for this was it doesn't max out in a way. They can look at it as a function of their mobility target. They may be basically they can get to those variations of F, the 1 to the 1.1 to the 1.2, by looking at this and how it compares to that mobility target. And these vary based off facility, and also vary based on that context for that facility, whether it's within a metropolitan planning organization, not in a metropolitan planning organization, but yet still inside their urban growth boundary or in their true rural conditions. So they varied on context, and they have these measures also varied by the facility type. One thing that's worth noting is here's where they kind of get into those, they go beyond F as their mobility target. When they're looking at their Portland area, Central City, principal arterial is found here at the bottom of the table. They're looking even at temporal changes in congestion, and their mobility target within that peak of the peak is a 1.1 VC ratio. We're looking at their second most congested hour on those shoulder periods, because they're seeing their peak hours they're seeing a spreading phenomenon, have a mobility target of 0.99 for that second hour. So taking into account that they've seen the spreading, and also also seeing that they're seeing higher congestion than what they could get with an A through F type scheme. So they use volume to capacity. They also noted that locals may require special areas to adjust mobility targets to match local conditions. And so for MMAs, they would have mobility targets can be eliminated entirely, because they're not trying to achieve a VC ratio. They're instead trying to encourage and build out a more robust multimodal network to meet the transportation demand. when the build condition for, as they look at mitigation, will not meet mobility targets, it provides an opportunity to negotiate improvements. But commonly they will request creative improvements, such as investments in bike ped facilities outside of study in order to fill system gaps. So again, another example of a DOT that's not looking for those big roadway improvements. Instead, they're often looking for investments in supporting infrastructure for other modes. So safety is becoming a priority for them to ensure safe operations in congested conditions. So a lot of cases they're not looking at capacity improvements, but rather looking at improvements that will maintain a safe traveling environment for all road users. And when it comes to capacity improvements, they have very limited funds for those. So they're using these mobility targets to help prioritize investments, but often they're not being able to meet them for motor vehicle roadway type improvements. So we'll pause here and check back in with the questions. Good question here was, do other states look at segment level of service? I don't read, there's some states that note, that we've already talked about, that note that they have a guideline for segment level of service, but in all of our conversations, no one really ever did it other than Florida.
Yeah, this is Gary Sokolow, and that's been my experience, my sad experience, that that even starting when we created our first tables, nobody seemed interested in adopting them. They keep sticking with the. I mean, there's still, of course, segment level of service for the uninterrupted facilities and freeways, but for the at-grade arterials, most of the states, I believe, and especially the ones that we've spoken to, right, use intersection.
I think Washington DOT was the one that they did probably a little more than any of the others. I mean, I do recall that they did mention they did look at that some.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
So there's a question here is, how do they quantify or qualify safety in their assessment? That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how they are quantifying or qualifying. Certainly, in some cases, there was mention of looking at the highway safety manual, but in a lot of other cases, it seemed like it was more on a professional judgment. And ultimately, a lot of the safety stuff they were talking about is what may be a safety improvement for one mode may actually be a problem for other modes. So they're really trying to look at all the balanced impacts on as they're assessing potential safety improvements.
Yeah, this is Gary Sokolow again, and let me just state one instance of that has come up recently for us, and that is the exclusive right turn lane. We have been designing at DOT the right turn lane to be as long as the expected through movement queue. The idea here is that there should be nobody who wants to turn left, and wants to turn right, that is stuck in the through lane. That's considered something that is, wasteful, because they're sitting there in traffic. So we have been building the right turn lanes to accommodate what we think would be anybody who would turn right. Now we've come to realize that that's a push and pull between how wide that intersection becomes. The same with dual lefts or triple lefts. That intersection, the wider it gets, the the harder it is, the more stress there is to cross it. So at some point there is, you weigh the pedestrian comfort with the fact that there are people now that used to be, that used to be designed to turn left to right with very little resistance, now having to wait.
We have another question here. The term mobility target is used widely. Is the target the same as a requirement or standard? In other words, what is the remedy if targets are missed? It's a very astute observation. So a lot of times they were used as targets, and there's certainly some teeth to them that they, in the cases where the DOT had the authority, they could then look at improvements when the targets are not met. I think the reason the term targets was used is there's maybe less recourse if they're not met. It opens up the mitigation options for the DOT to have more of a discussion with the developer, or in the case of their own program, that they can be missed. They can still be looked at as and start the conversation of there are improvements that need to be made, and it still has some teeth to that, but they're not held to the fire that they must meet the goal. Because I think a lot of the DOTs that we were talking to understood that they don't want to be that constrained, and be able to look at some of these multimodal improvements and other things, and the term target kind of seemed to open that up for them. Is safety level considered as one of the measures by any DOT? Richard, that's why I can't recall of any specific measures that were used. Do you?
No, I don't. No.
This is Gary Socolow. I answered for Florida DOT, and the answer there is that over the past few years, we have definitely had a push to use the Highway Safety Manual in our project analysis, yet we don't do it on every one, and there's still a lot of people that need to be trained to use it. But there have been examples where we have at DOT spent more money on right-of-way because of an analysis done using some of the factors in the Highway Safety Manual. So it just wasn't part of this study. But you're going to see this being, you're going to see this being, as important. So, yeah. All right. So, as I said, you'll see it as the use of the Highway Safety Manual becomes, we get more educated in it. I think you're going to see it more. And I was just been told that I use the term safety level, and that's not really correct. It should be the term safety performance. And I got this directly from somebody who is on our highway safety team.
All right, so we'll talk about our last state that we talked to, which we were all very excited to talk to with their change in state rule on the use of level of service, and see how that's working for them. So we had this meeting on the 21st of July, a wide variety of folks. So the Governor's Office of Planning and Research recommended using VMT as the most appropriate measure of transportation impacts. And a lot of the discussion was about this is the proposed rule, and so the Caltrans is still reacting to this rule change and developing guidance as we speak. Their previous guidance was for level of service D. It was widely recognized this was not feasible, so it was really not used in practice at all. Their internal training programs really focused on safety and other key issues, and did not address what was in their guidance of trying to achieve a level of service standard of D. So this is older materials out of there, but they looked at what their existing and no-build condition were, and tried to establish a target condition based on those existing and no-build conditions. And their measures, they looked at level service, and ultimately what was the driver of level of service were these primary measures as well. But where they're going, which is maybe the more interesting thing, is again they weren't really following what was in their own guidance, is this minimal utility. That's their emerging focus. They have a strong desire to align higher level policy objectives with on the ground reality and achievable goals. And so they are planning on using this concept of minimal utility that is defined by the local context, and looking at measures of effectiveness that are defined based on local objectives. Again, a lot of when we were looking at environmental studies, looking at the purpose and need, establishing what these particular goals based on the input that is received for that particular area, that particular locality. So looking at things such as minimum speed, such as just maintaining flow on freeways rather than just complete breakdown. In mixed use areas, maybe a primary measure of effectiveness would be pedestrian connectivity. Do we have a robust pedestrian network that can get us everywhere we would want to be? Another one for those mixed use areas could be trying to minimize vehicular and pedestrian, and also vehicular and bike conflicts. Or looking at a rural area, one of the things they're looking at is trying to minimize cycle failures, where they're not able to get through all the volume through in one cycle of a signal. And what they're looking to do is trying to look at these measures of effectiveness to address multiple objectives. They're looking from the environmental goals that they have as a state, the safety goals that they have as a state, and the mobility goals that they have as of a state. So they're seeing this minimal utility as the preferred way moving forward to achieve those multiple objectives. So as they're developing these measures of effectiveness, VMT will be a focus, but it's not really applicable for evaluating more local impacts. They are looking at safety as an important indicator, but have a desire to rely less on crash data, but focus more on known safety factors. And they're using a lot of simulation there. Then it will remain an important assessment tool, not necessarily for level of service, but looking at other performance measures such as queuing and coordination and fuel usage. Again, trying to address those multiple objectives. As it comes to federal coordination, we asked about this. Basically, they said, level of service is already not applicable. So, and the purpose and need process that we're using on their environmental review already leads to other measures, even when they're working on federal highway projects. They have a goal for local coordination is to provide statewide guidance to help shape the local process, and then allow for consistent development of meaningful solutions that address key issues. So they're in this process now of developing that statewide guidance, and hoping and really partnering with the locals and trying to establish that. So we'll pause again for some questions. one question was, is there a preferred simulation tool in California? Our experience has been they've been using Vissim. Mostly now it seems like our experience, at least nationwide, that has been the preferred simulation tool, be over and above CoreSim or some of the other alternatives. All right. So key takeaways we had from these discussions and how it will, and we passed this along to the level of service task team in Florida just to see what, if any, changes to the way Florida's policy is set up or the application of its policy is carried out. See if this would trigger any modifications. What we had as key takeaways from these discussions was the importance of statewide policy and establishment of measure of effectiveness targets and standards. That was pretty universal, but the variability of measures of effectiveness with many of the states varied by region and density, which we saw as very appropriate, as people have differing expectations of mobility based on how dense an area they're in. There was a focus on mitigation and a good consideration of other modes. One thing we noticed that when it comes to other modes, there was not really a lot of use of multimodal level of service. As the established policy and measure of effectiveness targets, we noted that effective policy provides an opportunity for a state DOT to participate in local negotiations, which was really important. They use those targets and standards as an opportunity to discuss potential mitigation measures with locals. They may not have the authority to enforce them, but it gives them a seat at the table, which is very important to maintaining the statewide system. And there was wide recognition that insistence on meeting unrealistic mobility goals, it was just not reasonable. So a lot of cases people have moved beyond level of service and are looking at these other mobility goals. Again, as we've mentioned, having those regional contexts, Oregon, Washington, New Jersey specifically tailored their target measures of effectiveness based on urban context. And Oregon and Washington even go one step further and allow locals to redefine targets based on their local priorities. Clearly defining targets based on context also explicitly recognizes that on-the-ground reality, allowing for negotiations to begin with a reasonable starting point and really trying to, again, enhance the mobility for the area, but not necessarily try to achieve a level of service D, which may not be a feasible improvement. It's noted that New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Oregon rely on volume capacity or delay in order to assess impacts even when no-build operations are level service F. That really provides them a negotiation standpoint that if it's a 1.1 and it goes to a 1.2, there's a variation within that level of service band of F, and it provides a quantifiable discussion basis. And some states will use the negotiation process to push for investments in other modes rather than mitigating vehicle operations back to no-build condition. We say some states, but ultimately it seemed that's where most states were heading, is building their way out of congestion for motor vehicles is just not a reasonable expectation that investing in alternative modes is the best way to improve mobility, specifically in their urban areas. So as I mentioned before, what we found was there's little or no use of the multimodal level of service procedure or target goals for other modes. A lot of the goals get to be, as we show here on the bottom, looking at connectivity, filling gaps and things like that was a lot of the measures when we were looking at bicycle and pedestrian. And then Pennsylvania clearly defined multimodal trip generation reduction factors, giving credit to developments in environments with ped bike infrastructure and transit service, although it may be too low in some of their most urbanized areas. So that gets us to the end of our presentation. So we'll look and see if there's some more questions. Question is here is how do you compare VisSim and Synchro latest versions?
Brian, this is Gary. I was trying to answer that myself, and
Okay.
what I said was that if we knew which was the best, that we would be really popular. We could probably make some money, but like I explained, that a lot of this is a matter of preference, and every tool having its strengths and weaknesses, and every individual having their tastes for the input format and the output. I think we can all say that none of us really like the highway capacity software screens, but it's still a very good tool. So it's kind of a question that can't be answered, and it was followed up with a question specifically for signal optimization, and I was about ready to answer that. If you are a member of ITE, there has been a recent community thread on the best software for signal optimization, and there were a number of people who said that they do it with a spreadsheet, and they feel that that is superior to these are people that know what they're doing, and they're saying that a lot of the fancy tools have gotten people away from understanding the measures required to optimize signals. I thought that was really interesting. So once again, we have no opinion whether VISM or HCS optimization or Synchro is better for signal optimization. In fact, maybe doing it on a Excel spreadsheet that you put together based on what you learned as a traffic engineer might be the best. You can disagree with me.
I think that's a great answer. I think that's a great answer, Gary. Yeah, it certainly does depend. One other question here is how is the standard is set for each category of primary measure based on facility types? If you're talking about at the DOT level, you know, ultimately, first there's a lot of the discussions that we were having. It's a question of what's the right measure first. Is where a lot of these folks are going, and certainly California is in the middle of that. Is what's the most appropriate measure that we can use to again, because what you measure is what you're going to be performing to. So that's the first question, and what they're doing is they're having a lot of discussion, and then even going through some scenarios of how that would lead. And then after that, after they set the measure, then they're looking, at least from the discussion, they're having a lot of discussions amongst the agency as well as with their stakeholder partners as well as the public in order to help them set what would be appropriate standards. Certainly, they have to understand their baseline as well in order to help establish those standards. There was a question also about continued follow-up with these, and I know, Gary, you did answer this, but yeah, we are continuing to follow up. In fact, all the states that we spoke with were very interested in what all the other states were sharing with them. So we are looking to get these results documented beyond just this PowerPoint so that we can share that information back to the states who so graciously gave us some of their time to understand how they approach these things, so we can continue that conversation. And that follow-up question on that, how is each standard is set? You know, we didn't dig into, like I said, where they're having some of their discussions about what is appropriate, what's the right measure. We didn't get into discussions actually of how they establish that the actual number that they actually landed on as their target. And Gary, there was a question on whether the participants can get a copy of this presentation file.
See, the one thing you have to learn in these, you got to give the person on the other hand a little bit of time to unmute themselves. And so the answer is absolutely yes. When we send a summary of this presentation out, we will have a link to the presentation. We also should have some links to some of the primary materials that were discussed, and what else? Oh, and the PDFs. Martin has communicated with you that the American Planning Association, that you have a number and to post in your reporting, and but for professional engineers in the state of Florida and many other places where they're using self-reporting, we will also have a detailed attendance sheet of those who are on. We don't need your PE number anymore. It would probably be best for you to, if the name needs to be spelled differently so it matches what's on your certificate, you can ask us to do that. But we will send you a list of attendees that should really be all you need for your self-reporting. All right. Okay, and if those are all the questions, I really would like to thank Richard Barr and Brian Smolkowski. This has been probably one of the more exciting, exciting for transportation nerds, studies that we've gotten into, because we'd heard so much about California, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, only to find out that they do have some lessons for us. But in many ways, we're all doing the best we can within reason, and that is really the answer in most cases, because you can't completely build your way out of congestion unless, let me see here, I'm making myself a presenter, and I don't know how many of you are familiar. Well, that is not what I wanted you to see. Great. Show. Hold on. I promise it will be good. All right. This is a road in Burma leading into the capital, and I wish I had it slightly larger, but I don't think there'll be any congestion on this road for a long time. And but if we want congestion-free highways, this is the model. Okay. So with that, we will end this presentation, and I think you have our email addresses, so you can ask us questions, and we should have a summary with a report and links to all of the reports that we mentioned. So with that, thank you so much for your interest, and have a great day and weekend. And I'm going to end it right now.